While Five Nights at Freddy's has a very large amount of mysteries and speculation surrounding in-universe events, such as what we see in the books, games, and so on, there's been one mystery outside any official piece of FNAF media that's confused theorists for years now: the Retcon issue. This is the biggest meta mystery in the FNAF franchise, one that might change everything we thought we knew about this franchise and its lore and timeline, and I think I've actually cracked the code to what the one Retcon actually is. But before we get into that, what is a retcon, and what am I even talking about? Well, get ready, because it's time to uncover the truth behind FNAF's weirdest out-of-universe mystery. I'm WitheredCircle, and it's time to solve the one FNAF retcon with the help of a very special Five Nights at Freddy's theorist. Here we go. To begin with, the definition of a retcon is a piece of new information that imposes a different interpretation on previously described events, typically used to facilitate a dramatic plot shift or account for an inconsistency. The word retcon itself is an abbreviated version of the words retroactive continuity. Basically, it's if a canon or in-universe piece of information that directly contradicts a previous piece of information is given to us in fictional media. For example, if Chica the chicken from the first game had no buttons on her chest, and Scott later depicted that same Chica as having buttons, that would be a retcon. Anyway, while you might think Five Nights at Freddy's is full of these kinds of contradictions, the creator of the franchise, Cawthon himself, has gone out and said that there has only been one retcon in the entire story. On September 4th, 2017, a few months before the release of Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria Simulator, Scott made a Reddit post regarding what he called the Retcon issue. I will read this post out for the sake of clarity, before going over what I think Scott is trying to tell us in this post. Hey guys, I wanted to comment quickly on the subject of retcons. I made a joke last night about retconning, and it became obvious that it's very important to a lot of people, and understandably so. I have a lot of respect for this community, and the last thing that I want is for anyone to think that I recklessly change details on a whim. I assure you, that's not the case. The truth is that I've done one actual retcon in the series, although I'm not going to say where it was. There have been other times, however, when my original intentions didn't come across clearly. In those instances, I make a point to clarify in the next game. That's not really a retcon. It's simply an attempt to guide the story toward where it was originally intended to go. A quick and very minor example of this would be when Adult Theory happened. I could see why people were believing it, so I quickly dropped an additional teaser to clear it up. I have to do that with my game sometimes as well. I used Sister Location to clear up a misconception from FNAF 4. Currently, there is a misconception from Sister Location that I may need to clear up someday as well, or maybe I'll just leave it to torment the fandom. So, while it's true that the story has developed new details over time that may not have been planned from the beginning, that doesn't mean that the pieces don't fit together as a whole. There is a lot of information crammed into these games, and there will always be details that I don't convey 100% as intended. I try to clear up those items, but I'm certainly not retconning things at will. I have more respect for the community than that. Edit. To be clear, the one retcon mentioned was integrated pretty seamlessly, and most people didn't notice. If it had caused problems or confusion, then I would have addressed it here. What does this post mean, and what information can we glean from it? Well, first off, the joke Scott is referring to is a comment he made on a different post where he said he'd never done a retcon in the entire series, and that everything had been planned out since day one. Obviously, it's clear that this is not the case. Scott also goes on to say that in order to avoid too many retcons being made, he tries to course correct past mistakes or misconceptions in future titles, like what he did with Sister Location, where he revealed that the FNAF 4 nightmares were connected to an underground testing chamber, and not dreams like we thought. And even with the new era of games after Security Breach, where he adapted the lore of the Pizzaplex after the unfortunate, and may I say accidental, introduction of Burn Trap. More on this later. This is called retroactive storytelling, and you can tell by the way this franchise's story progressed that Scott Cawthon uses this trick a lot. Just as Scott said in the original post, just because parts of the story are altered to better fit the narrative as the FNAF story goes on, that doesn't mean that the pieces don't fit together as a whole. So, while Scott might have changed some past plot points in future titles, there's only ever been one glaring contradiction, one that couldn't fit together with what had come before, and that was pretty seamless with few people talking about it. So, what was it? Well, that's what I'm here to find out. Other YouTubers have covered the mysterious FNAF retcon in the past, but I think it's safe to say that the majority of them might have been wrong. One of the biggest misconceptions about this retcon actually stems from Matpat. In June of 2023, Game Theory put out a short claiming that the puppet was originally meant to be possessed by the crying child, and that the big FNAF retcon was the gender change of the kid in the Take Cake to the Children minigame from FNAF 2. For those of you who don't know, one of the minigames in FNAF 2 that you can get access to by dying is the aforementioned Take Cake to the Children minigame, where you play as Freddy giving out cakes to kids, until a purple guy, William Afton, arrives in a car and stabs a crying child standing outside. The letters being called out in the background of this one are "Save him," and we get a jump scare from the puppet at the end. We see a different version of the same event in the Security Puppet minigame from Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria Simulator, except this time something's different. The kid we're saving is a girl. Charlotte Emily. Matpat's theory is a valid assumption for the identity of the FNAF Retcon, but it's inherently flawed because, as I brought up earlier, Scott made his post 3 months before the release of Pizza Sim, where we see the security puppet minigame that started all this, and obviously Scott wouldn't be talking about having made a retcon that people talked about if the game it was in wasn't even out yet. There's an even bigger issue with this. This gender change was not seamless at all, as the Reddit post makes it seem it was. Everyone was talking about it after FNAF 6 came out. Personally, I think the Save Him text uses male pronouns either because the animatronic Charlotte is possessing is male, or because Henry Emily, or even the minigame itself, mistakes Charlotte for her brother Sammy Emily, as we see happen in the FNAF novel trilogy. So, while this might seem like a retcon, chances are either Scott doesn't see this as a contradiction but rather as a course correction, or his definition of a retcon, which we'll talk about later in the video, is different from the one I talked about earlier. But if this isn't the mysterious FNAF retcon, what is? Is it even possible to find out what Scott is talking about? Well, I think it is, because we have a very specific time frame to work with. Late last year, me and some other FNAF theorists sat in a Discord call for 2 hours trying to figure out what the retcon was. We came to a conclusion that, looking back, I disagree with, but there was one key takeaway from the call that I think is worth bringing up here. The retcon, probably from the very first FNAF game. In the post, Scott mentions that certain things in FNAF 4 had to be elaborated on in sister location, but that they're not retcons, which to me implies that the retcon is in one of the first 3 games. And since FNAF 2 and 3 don't seem to have any glaring contradictions with each other or anything particularly out of the ordinary, I look towards FNAF 1. After all, anything left in FNAF 1 would have been pretty seamless and wouldn't have drawn too much attention from the fanbase. Sure enough, FNAF 1 was where I found my answer. On that call, the conclusion we came to was that the retcon came from one of the 4 newspapers that can appear in the East Hall corner on the cameras. These newspapers were how we first learned about the missing children incident and how its direct aftermath led to the closing of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. However, one of these newspapers, which detailed what happened to the supposed perpetrator of the murders, was where we thought we had found our retcon. Because in the paper titled 5 Children Now Reported Missing, Suspect Convicted, we're told that the man who committed the crime, who we now know to be William Afton, was arrested and later officially charged for the crime, meaning that whoever these newspapers were talking about got sent straight to jail. Or worse. Obviously, thanks to William's appearance in quite literally every other game after FNAF 1 and some extra explanation in the Silver Eyes, we know he wasn't charged or sent to jail, but was instead apprehended and later released due to the bodies of the kids not being found. Could this be the retcon? Well, I'm not so sure. There's a non-zero chance that Scott did know the difference between arrested and convicted, and this newspaper is just a simple slip-up. However, I have an alternative explanation. William wasn't the one who got blamed for the murders. It was Henry. I have a video going more in detail on the subject that should release in about 2 weeks, so I won't spoil everything here, but I think that Henry's absence in the franchise is explained by him being blamed for the murders by William, as we sort of see him do in the Silver Eyes trilogy. Again, I won't elaborate on this too much so I don't spoil my video on the subject, but definitely keep an eye out for that one. Also, yet again, just as with the Charlotte Emily gender change, this retcon isn't seamless at all. In fact, it was heavily discussed and changes the entire FNAF story if this is actually true. So, what could the real retcon be? Well, this is where I had to dig real deep. The majority of the exposition we get in FNAF 1 comes from Ralph the phone guy, who guides us during the first 4 nights, giving us advice and some lore clues as well as details on Fazbear Entertainment and the animatronics. We get the most information on the night 1 phone call, which is also the longest call in the game. I spent a good amount of time analyzing the transcript of this call looking for anything that could contradict future events, and that was when I found it.
The animatronic characters here do get a bit quirky at night, but do I blame them? No. If I were forced to sing those same stupid songs for 20 years and I never got a bath, I'd probably be a bit irritable at night too.
That's right, the funny meme line is actually relevant to the lore, specifically the bit where Phone Guy tells us the animatronics have been singing the same stupid songs for 20 years. We have reason to assume that FNAF 1 takes place in the early to mid-90s, and I personally believe it takes place in 1992 due to the evidence given to us by The Week Before, the first full-length FNAF interactive novel. We also know thanks to the Faz coins we can collect in multiple modern-era FNAF games that Fazbear Entertainment and the first ever Freddy Fazbear's Pizza were founded in 1983. It doesn't take a math genius to understand that 1983 plus 20 doesn't equal 1992 in any scenario. Even if you use the excuse that Phone Guy is referring to the Fredbear's characters, this doesn't work, since Fredbear's Family Diner most likely opened in 1979. So, as stupid as this may seem, I think there's good reason to assume that Phone Guy's 20 years line is the one retcon. Think about it. It happened before FNAF 6, it's seamless because it can be interpreted as Phone Guy exaggerating, and it's immediately course corrected by later games, and especially FNAF 4, which implies Freddy's only opened in 1983. Not only would this explain why Scott felt the need to retcon something in the franchise, but it would also fit pretty well into how random some of the stuff in this franchise can be. While Charlotte's gender change, the 2 bites, and all the other weird things are examples of Scott altering the story without contradictions, this particular tiny detail needed to be retconned in order to continue the story. Some people have suggested that FNAF 1 was originally supposed to happen in the 2000s, with the pizzeria first being opened in the 1980s, explaining why the newspapers say the tragedy at Freddy Fazbear's happened many years ago, when by our modern understanding of the lore, it was only about 7 years before FNAF 1. I like this idea, and overall I think the seamless retcon Scott was talking about was when FNAF 1 took place. You could argue that it was always meant to be the 90s because of the paycheck, but even with that, it's more than likely that Scott intended it to happen in the present day, as a sort of play on that generation's fear of Chuck E. Cheese. After all, that is what inspired Five Nights at Freddy's. But there's something else we need to talk about. What Scott Cawthon means when he says the word retcon. Scott has never been a definitions guy. I'm seriously considering sending him a dictionary for his birthday, which I will if this video hits 1,000 likes, because the way he uses words like canon, continuity, and others make little to no sense and don't match up with anything else in the English language. For example, while the word canon normally means everything that happens in a certain continuity or universe, in Scott's interpretation, every piece of official FNAF media is canon, but not necessarily in continuity. Could it be that this kind of weird definition carried over to how he uses the word retcon? What if the so-called retcon was just an internal, unannounced change Scott made to how he viewed the story? Or what if it was just an example of extreme retroactive storytelling? This is an interesting train of thought, but I digress, as I think it's unlikely for Scott to invent a whole new definition of the word retcon. But I'll let today's guest, GiBi's Horror Homestead, take it from here.
Hi, this is GiBi from GiBi's Horror Homestead, and when Withered brought up this idea, I immediately latched onto it as the obvious answer to this long-burning question. My philosophy is always to take FNAF evidence in context, and that the lore importance of a piece of evidence is equal to the presence of that piece of evidence itself. Small piece of evidence, probably a small lore implication. If we look at the one retcon in the context that Scott said it, we can safely assume that Scott wasn't planning on telling us that this retcon even happened. He made a joke that he regretted the next day, and then he felt like he had to clear that up. If he'd never made that spur-of-the-moment joke, he almost certainly never would have told us that there was a retcon at all. This means the retcon is so minor and seamless, as he says, that it wasn't impacting theorizing. Knowledge of this retcon existing should not be something that a theory hinges on, because this Reddit post made by Scott is such a tiny detail in FNAF history, and it should not be blown out of proportion. What makes the 20 years comment fit my criteria so well is what Withered already said. People were already kind of ignoring it. Humans can exaggerate when talking. When Phone Guy said 20 years without a bath, we don't think he literally wants the animatronics to be in a bathtub. And so we shouldn't literally think it's been 20 years since the founding of the company. Or even more literally, 20 years since these animatronics were cleaned, changed, looked at. We know that can't be true, there's different heads in the parts and services room. I think the original intention of this line of dialogue was to put the MCI 20 years before the start of FNAF 1. The newspaper says that the disappearances were long ago, and Scott was just hinting toward this long history of the company. But as he expanded the story with future sequels, he felt that he could just fudge those years a little bit. People definitely noticed that Phone Guy said 20 years, but very few people I see build timelines off of FNAF 1 taking place in, like, 2003. We all just kind of assume he was exaggerating, which is what makes it a seamless retcon. When the week before it came out, people were freaking out trying to figure out how Capellia's age and different pop culture references could determine when FNAF 1 took place, but no one cared about the 20-year line, because human beings can exaggerate and be wrong, so Phone Guy's line isn't hard evidence. The fact that 1983 has been drilled home as the start date of Freddy's constantly in all the newer games just shows that this is something Scott continues to want to move past. If you say 1983 a dozen times and 20 years once, most people are gonna forget the 20 years comment. I love this because it's a small, seamless change to the story, but it's also understandable why Scott would think of this as a serious retcon. He intended this to be a hint, and then had to actually change what it meant later. The other things that he's cleared up over the years were just that, things that he cleared up. This was a change of his intention. Thank you for having me on, Withered. I'm gonna go back to reading the FNAF books now and trying to figure out why Susie's hair changes colors.
Thanks for coming on, GiBi. But while I do think the 20-year detail was the retcon Scott was talking about in that original post, I think there's been one more retcon since then, Burn Trap. In the Afton ending of Security Breach, you face off against Burn Trap, who appears to be an even more burnt version of Afton's corpse, hence the name. And yet, that's the first and only time we've ever seen him. There's no trace of the guy in Ruin or Help Wanted 2. Instead, we see the Mimic. We learned through the second Doco interview with Scott that Burntrap's addition to Security Breach was a mistake, and that he was likely meant to be a hallucination you'd see every so often in the corner of your eye, hinting at Gregory having been possessed by the Glitchtrap virus in the past. After the big miscommunication that was Security Breach's lore, Scott was forced to course correct and likely made the Mimic and Burntrap be one and the same. I'm not saying that the Mimic itself was a retcon, just that it needed to be added into the lore in a way Scott didn't expect. And with that, I end my analysis of FNAF's 2 retcons. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and if you did, please consider liking and subscribing, but most importantly commenting your opinion down below. That will be all from me.